Hi, life group leaders. It's time for a lesson. We're moving into James now. I'm really going to try to do a good job with this week, but I've been sick and my voice is kind of thin. I hope that this blesses you as I work through it. If I start coughing or whatever, I'll try and edit that out. But this is going to be a good look at James chapter 1, and I just hope it'll help your class belong, believe, and become. All right, so jumping in, James is writing to Christians who value spirituality and they consider themselves to be pretty spiritual people, but they're really not. So what he does is he writes this very practical description about what genuine Christian spirituality looks like, and that's a word you're going to hear a lot over the next several weeks is practical. James is immensely practical book. James was the half-brother of Jesus. This is not James, the brother of John, the disciple. This is James, the half-brother of Jesus. And just some background on him, he didn't believe that Jesus was the Messiah until after Jesus died and rose again and ascended into heaven. But he did become a believer, and then he became a very prominent leader in the church at Jerusalem. James was martyred in 62 AD, and so this book was obviously written before that, and that's why one of the reasons why it's paired with Galatians is because Galatians and James really are the earliest books that we have written in the New Testament. So they kind of pair together there. They also pair together thematically because Paul says that we're justified by faith alone, but James says that justification should move us on to be different, that we shouldn't stay where we are, but that we should become like Jesus. We should have an impact in our world, that we should be salt and light, that we should make a difference for Christ, that our lives should be changed because we are justified by faith. And so right there, we're just going to jump in with chapter 1. The letter of James is a very practical letter to the church, and that's why he immediately writes about one of the most practical issues that we all have to face, and that is adversity or trials or tests, whatever your translation has. Christians are not exempt from adversity, and sometimes it impacts us even more than people who don't know Jesus. But as children of God, we are given the means to get more out of facing adversity. And this passage explains to us today 4 perspectives that enable to do that. How do we get the maximum out of our suffering? Number 1 is to understand the purpose of adversity. If you look in 2 through 4, specifically verse 2, he says, "Consider it pure joy, brethren, when you face trials of many kinds. No matter what kind or how painful the adversity I experience, I should consider it an occasion to rejoice." And that poses a serious question. I mean, why should I consider joy when a loved one dies, or when I get a serious illness, or when I experience disappointment, when my goals are frustrated, when I'm hated and unfairly treated by other people, when my children make poor decisions, when I experience a financial setback, when my own efforts to sincerely serve God have failed, or when I experience painful consequences of my own bad choices? Why should I choose to rejoice? Why should I choose joy when any of those things happen? And the reality is, to experience joy in such kind of situations seems ridiculous, and honestly it even seems cruel of God. And I think that would be true if not for verses 3 and 4, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Perseverance must finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking in anything. Consider is the big word there, I think. The reason why we should rejoice is because of what we know, not what we are feeling. Consider is not an emotional response, it's a thoughtful response. And that thought and that thing that we know is in the midst of all kinds of trials, God is sovereignly working through them with a good purpose. And just real quickly, God is not the cause of all things that happen, nor does he say that all things that happen are good. Either one of those situations would make God evil, and he would be the source of evil. But because God is sovereign and loving, he can work through every situation, including evil, for his good. And you see Romans 8:28 for that. But what is this good purpose? Paul says in Romans 8, if you see in verse 29, Paul says that it's to conform to the character of Christ. James says that it's for growth and maturity in verse 4. Why does an athlete need a coach? It's to be in the best physical condition they are and to develop their skill to reach their maximum potential. A good coach or a trainer, or however you want to look at it, creates an individually designed program for you to develop, your muscle tone, to build stamina, and to perfect your skills. And this involves several different types of suffering and inconvenience and pain. And sometimes you don't even understand what your coach is trying to do, but you realize in the end that the pain was worth it because it helps you carry out your goal. James says that God is a coach in a far more important area in our lives, and that's the development of our character and the realization of His purpose in our lives. And God is better than any human coach for a couple of reasons. First, He loves us perfectly, and therefore He always trains us for good, and He doesn't take revenge on us. And the second is that He knows everything. He is sovereign, and He knows how to work through the adversity to get the maximum potential out of us. And although we can't always see how this works at the moment, we can trust God in His love and His sovereignty to see us through difficult circumstances. So we got to understand God's purpose during adversity. Maybe He would like to break us of complacency, or He's trying to reveal undetected pride or vanity. Maybe it's to draw us closer to Him in a way that we haven't experienced Him, just a sweeter or more real way. Maybe God is preparing us for some form of service that we don't have any concept of. But I can tell you this, not understanding the reason for the trial doesn't mean that God's will isn't being carried out. Our response to the test is what determines whether God's purpose for our lives will be fulfilled or frustrated. And due to this reason, James explains practically how to respond appropriately to adversity in contrast to inappropriate responses, which we see in 1:5 through 8. And so as we go through a trial, the first thing that we should do is to figure out what God is trying to teach us. James, and that's a hard thing to do. And James says in verse 5, if any of us lacks wisdom, in other words, if we don't know how to experience joy in the trial, then we should ask God. Go to Him and ask Him, hey, what are you trying to teach me? I had an advisor and a good mentor in my life he had a phrase that he always liked to say, was that every moment is a teachable moment. So it's our job to go to God and ask Him, what are you trying to teach me? What is it that I need to learn? What are you working on specifically on my character? How should I respond in this particular moment? And I can tell you this, guys, that nothing pleases a coach more than to hear their athletes ask these type of questions. How can I get better? But our asking God for wisdom is not some kind of magic formula that just sends an automatic response from God. They have to be accompanied by the right attitude. And you can see that in verses 6 through 8. This can be a problematic passage because it seems to be saying that anytime we try to hedge our bets on trusting God, that God will reject our request. And I don't know necessarily that's the case. And I know that each one of us, if we're experiencing a trial, that there's feelings of doubt in the trial, that we get discouraged and we have these sort of feelings. But I believe it's not about feelings. It's about our personal attitude toward God during the test, which is something that we can choose regardless of how we feel. To ask in faith means to approach God by choosing to trust that He's sovereign, that He knows what He's doing, and that He's lovingly involved in our adversity. It means to affirm Romans 8:28, that God works all things together for His good. I believe that you were involved in this trial for your good, and I want to do your will in my life. Please show me what you're trying to teach me and how you want me to respond. And that's just a really, really solid way of putting good theology to work. I think doubting means failing or refusing to adopt this attitude with God. It means that we believe that our circumstances or our feelings are above God's word, and we conclude, however subtly we may do it, that God isn't involved, that He doesn't care, and that He can't help. And I know personally that it's possible to go through the Christian motions of prayer and quoting scripture and technically asking for the right things, but secretly denying that God is sovereign and trying to find a way out of my circumstances, or even being angry at God for allowing it. And in that case, then I'm one of the double-minded people. I say the right things, but I believe the wrong things. And what happens when we have this kind of attitude? We prevent God from giving us wisdom. You can see that in verse 7. And we remain unstable, and we're subject to our circumstances and our feelings, which is the exact opposite of what God has called us to be. So to summarize this passage, kind of 6 through 8, why do some Christians become more confident of God's faithfulness during suffering? Why do they seem to stabilize during suffering, while others remain confused, angry, or enslaved to their passions? And the answer can be traced back to your usual response to God when you have a test. What is your attitude? Are you secretly wanting your own way, or are you just humbly submitting yourself to His will? And really, the illustration that I like to use involves toothpaste, because we're like toothpaste. Whatever we put inside, whatever attitude we have inside of us, when there's a trial, it's like a tube of toothpaste that gets squeezed. And when you face a trial, you get squeezed, and whatever's inside of you comes out like that. And is this something that honors God, or is this something that doesn't honor God? It's an attitude, but I think that's really what James is getting at. And then moving on to point 3, which is like 9 through 12 in our study today, is we don't need to confuse temporary comfort with spiritual maturity. We're going to have people who struggle with this in our classes because we live in a very materialistic culture. One of the trials that the Christians were suffering that James is writing to was financial poverty. And in chapter 5, it also shows us that non-Christian wealthy people not only were not helping them, but they were exploiting them in their poverty. And because of that, James's audience was looking at their rich neighbors as people who really fared better than they did, that they were better off. And James sees this as a very dangerous attitude, and he tries to correct it in 9 through 12. Now, just a couple of things about wealth real quickly. The Bible never justifies the accumulation of riches without compassion, and it rejects the exploitation of other people in order to be wealthy. But at the same time, the Bible doesn't glorify just kind of worldly discomfort, and it doesn't say that we should seek out poverty. There is no biblical value in asceticism at all. The point that James is trying to make is don't confuse temporary comfort with our own spiritual well-being, because they aren't the same thing. And since spiritual maturity is more important than our own comfort, we should value spiritual maturity enough to welcome temporary discomfort, if God permits it in our lives, and to see it as proof that we are loved by God. And there are two real obvious applications of this truth. One is that we don't need to be envious of those who have lots of material things. You can see that in Mark 8:36. It's certainly not true that the one with the most toys wins, because you can't take it with you. In the best case, the person who has lots of toys have a solemn responsibility to manage it well. And you can see that in the parable of talents, that what God gives us, we have to be responsible with it. The worst case scenario is that people with lots of stuff are in danger of losing their lives by being addicted to comfort and allowing it to seduce them and stop them from knowing God and losing their soul, as it was evidently happening with these people in James. You can look at that in 10 and 11. More importantly, if you envy people who have more material possessions than you, it's a subtle jab at God saying, you love them more than you love me. You treat them better than you treat me. The second thing that we can do is realize that our temporary depravity can be a blessing in disguise. C.S. Lewis called material suffering the megaphone of God. And it's certainly been in a very effective way for God to give me in my own life a wake-up call. Physical pain and weakness cause us to feel our fragility. Confusion about what to do next reveals our lack of wisdom. Financial struggles indicate how limited our security is by ourselves. Errors, our own mistakes, and failures, they destroy our pride. And if we look at this and let these things lead us to God and let Him transform our character, we can realize how privileged we are to be disciplined in this way. Consider praying this with your class. God, I recognize my own tendency to want comfort more than maturity, and I forget you when I'm comfortable. Please do what's necessary to get my attention and capture my focus and keep my eyes on what's important. The last point about trials is in 13 through 18. I know our book only guides us through 15, but I think kind of the finishing thought and statement goes all the way to 18, and so I want to look at that. And that's basically beware of blaming somebody else for your own situation. If we are genuinely experiencing divinely permitted adversity, how often do we refuse to take responsibility for our response to it? Not for the cause of it, but just our response to it. I mean, you look at it in some ways like, people would say things like, God, I'm so lonely and I have these needs, and so I had no other choice but to seek out companionship outside of your plan for my life, whether that's pornography or extramarital affairs or whatever. Maybe it's the statement that, God, I was so mistreated, I have the right to be bitter. Or maybe it's, God, I was so hurt by failure that I'm never going to do that again. If we're not responsible for our response to adversity, then who is? What we're really saying is, whether we realize it or not, that we're blaming God when we sin. God, you let things get so bad that we had no choice but to take the actions that we did. And when you react this way under pressure, you might experience some short-term relief, like, oh God, it really wasn't my fault that I did that. But really, you're paving the way for long-term misery because you're a victim of circumstances and how others treat you, instead of being a child of God who freely chooses and who is working to increase his will in their lives. So James has a better solution. Like I said, I think this is 13 through 18, his better solution to this. Remember the loving sovereignty of God. God never influences anyone, actively or passively, to violate his will. In fact, 1 Corinthians 10:13 says that very point. Only good things come from God. You can see it in James verse 17. And the greatest thing he did for us was to make us his children when we come to Christ. You can see that in verse 18. Take responsibility for your response in adversity. The influence and the choice to do evil comes from ourselves, not from God. And you are never responsible for how other people treat you, but you are always responsible for how you respond to how they treat you. This can be painful in the short term. Nobody just wants to forgive somebody who cuts them off in traffic, or who, stabs them in the back at work, or any of these things. Short term, it's painful, but it opens you to experiences to God's forgiveness and results in just him producing more fruit of the Spirit in their lives in the long term. So the conclusion is this, from James chapter 1, Christian, you will suffer. The question is whether you want the suffering to bring about God's fruit in your life or not. And so I hope you guys have a blessed week. Praying for you. I hope you have a good discussion in your life groups. If you need anything, please let me know. Godspeed.